5 major developing economies meet virtually at a critical juncture as the world is divided over the benefits of globalization. 16 years after forming their partnership, feeling the impacts of the pandemic, BRICS members are seeking greater cooperation to boost their economies. The goals to help steer the changing international order in a more equitable and reasonable trajectory and serve the common interests of the international community. What will this mean for the world economy and global governance? Be sure to watch our special coverage of the 14th BRICS Summit with China as chair and host, only on CGTN.
Hello and welcome to our special program BRICS Hour, live from Beijing. I'm Guan. This year's gathering of BRICS leaders comes amid drastic changes in the world. Will the group of emerging powers inject new impetus to global economic recovery? How will developing countries build peace and prosperity together with stronger unity? What changes will the BRICS model bring to current global governance system? To discuss these issues, joining me today are 4 distinguished guests: Wang Wen, Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Welcome to the show. Mr. Wang, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. And our next guest is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira, former Chief Economic Advisor to the President of Brazil. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you. And Ostrovkii Andrei, head of the Center for Social and Economic Development of China at the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences. Good to see you today.
Okay. Good morning, everybody.
And our last guest is Yose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon from Jakarta.
Well, it's great to have all of you with us today. And Mr. Wang, let me start with you. China is hosting the summit this year, and the country has a big ambition for it, calling for a new era for global development. But we're all aware that the global economy is facing unprecedented challenges: the pandemic, the worsening food security, the supply chain disruptions. Help us understand, how can the group of emerging powers inject stability into the current turbulent world? How to make joint efforts to tackle these impending issues?
The economic growth rate of the emerging power now is twice that of the developed countries, especially China and India. Emerging countries have made great progress in poverty reduction, environmental protection, and social governance, and promoted world progress. In contrast, developed countries, especially the United States, in the past 20 years are retreating with frequent shocking, you all know, and it's ethnic conflict, financial crisis, and economic inflation. More importantly, the United States has pursued a policy of democratization and launched a war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and resulting in more than 1 million civilian deaths and more than 10 million refugees. So making the world worse and worse. So from this perspective, although emerging countries have many domestic problems, but we have to admit that the great contributions of emerging countries in the past 20 years, so that we see the hope for a better future for the world.
Right, I think they are going to playing a bigger role in international affairs. Mr. Wang, what efforts do you think are needed to tackle these impending issues of the world today?
So actually, we hope that the world will become better and better and much better than before. But now the problem is that the Western countries, especially the US, has no enough contributions to the world. So that's why the world needed the BRICS much more than before. And also especially China, India, Brazil, all contribute the world development especially, as I said, the poverty reduction, the environmental protection, social governance. I think this is a very real reality.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Teixeira, what are your thoughts on this? We are aware that the world today is facing great challenges to recovering international political and economic stability. What can BRICS do?
Okay, first of all, we need to understand the importance of BRICS in the world today. When you're talking, one of the great issues that we are facing is food security. BRICS countries, they represent more than 1/3 of the whole food production in the world, more 30% the GDP, almost 40% of the whole population. So when you're talking just checking balances about the importance of BRICS, the world cannot live or survive without BRICS. BRICS was set up 16 years ago to be a voice of developing economies. To be a louder voice of developing economies. The cooperation between the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, was created to enlarge the cooperation not only between those countries, but in the future with developing countries. So the importance of BRICS for the future of the world economy is paramount. Let me give you another example. We are talking about recovery of COVID-19. If we see the large countries that produce vaccines, we're going to have China, India, and Russia. Those countries are the largest producers of vaccines together with the United States in the world. And if you see cooperation among developing countries, those countries are responsible for more than 70% of the dosage used in developing countries in the world. So this gives two very important elements to see the importance of the BRICS countries now and in the future.
And there is so much that we can do together. And Mr. Andrei, what are your thoughts on this? How can BRICS usher a new era of global development against a tense geopolitical backdrop?
Thank you very much. Now it's a very important problem how to develop our world, because now I see there is a split between two large groups of the country in the world. I mean, just the emerging countries, for example, the BRICS countries, and other countries like the European countries and the US, Japan, New Zealand, for example, and Australia. And now naturally it's necessary to develop cooperation between the BRICS countries. I mean, 4 or 5 countries from Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Because judging by some statistical data, by territory, by the GDP, by population, these countries their ratio is very high. And now especially China. China now is one of the world leaders. Judging by some statistical data, maybe I can say it's a leader of the world just now. And it's necessary to develop cooperation between all these countries in the frame of the BRICS, that's BRICS countries. And now there are any other problems how to develop, how to enlarge this group of the BRICS countries. And in my opinion, it's necessary to only the economic development and struggle with food crisis and energy crisis. It's very important for the group of BRICS countries, because now all these countries have enough resources to struggle with all these crises. That's all.
Indeed, we're seeing mounting challenges and uncertainties in the world today. And Ms. Damuri, Indonesia is hosting the G20 this year. It is not part of BRICS now. What different roles do you see for G20 and BRICS in tackle our common challenges?
I think before going to the different roles, I think we have to also highlight that the two groups, the two clubs actually share a lot of overlapping and also interests and also aspirations. And like, for example, you mentioned about food insecurity, pandemic, about supply chain disruptions, about climate change mitigation and adaptations. All are also partly part of interest of G20, and BRICS, I think, also share a lot of interest with G20 countries, especially because all BRICS countries are also part of G20.
Yes.
But we also need to look at that in addition to the current summit among BRIC members. Next week we're also going to witness another important summit, which comes from the G7 summit, comes from the developed country summit. They also part of the G20 members. So G20, in my opinions, can provide a bridge between those emerging countries and developed countries, both in the G7 or BRICS or other countries, because we're going to have this kind of collaborations. We're going to have a greater cooperations from all developing, emerging, and also developed countries. You mentioned about the food insecurity and food crisis. Even this year alone, the WFP World Food Programs already predict that there would be the need of $20 billion for to overcome the food crisis for humanitarian purpose alone. And that a big amount of money cannot be supported only by certain group of countries. They have to come from all countries, including also from BRIC countries.
Indeed, I think we have to agree that developing countries are disproportionately affected by the problems of the world today, such as the food crisis. So, as a whole, they need to send a stronger voice. And Mr. Wang, currently BRICS countries account for 40% of the global population and a quarter of the global economy, but the potential is huge. How will BRICS mechanism enhance the voice of developing countries in international affairs, and why is it important for developing countries?
So actually, we all know that now BRICS countries share common strategic interests and all hope for national rights and the national rejuvenations. And also we know that all BRICS countries are promoting the scientific and technological innovation and digital economy. And all BRICS countries hope for global governance and the reform for the international systems. And all BRICS countries also hope for strategic autonomy. More importantly, all BRICS countries oppose sanctions and hope for peace and development, rather than causing an international conflict through security and other issues like the West. And we can look at the history. In the past 80 years after the World War II, most poor countries in the world dominated by the West, most poor countries now were still very poor. So now the rise of emerging countries has given more hope for the developing countries, because the BRIC country rise up first, then they can bring more and more developing countries rise up second. So at this time, emerging countries are more united, more cooperative, strengthen the microeconomy policy coordination, and promote global recovery and make the world more progress. I think this is very important.
Indeed, and unity among developing countries is very important right now. Mr. Teixeira, do you think the developing world needs to increase their representation in global governance? What can BRICS do?
I'm sure we need to increase the voice of developing countries. One of the things that BRICS stand for is the reformation of the United Nations system, the multilateralism. We do believe the 5 countries believe in a multilateral system. We believe that we need to give more voice for developing countries. As our colleague here, Yose, just mentioned, G20 is a very important bridge for this discussion, because we have the largest and very important developed countries there, but we have also the developing countries. So I think using G20 also play important role in the United Nations system is the key to improve and also to reform the United Nations system, so developing country has more voice in all the discussion. Sometimes G7 takes some decisions, like we saw minimum taxation and things like that doesn't take into account the developing countries. But when you look now developing countries, we see that China is the second largest economy in the world, sometimes the first one, depending how you analyze this. India is the fastest growing country in the world, and they are very important. You cannot just leave them aside because you split the world in developed and developing countries.
Do you think BRICS has sent a stronger voice to the world?
Yes, I think we have been doing a great work in terms of BRICS. I think there is a lot of challenge for us in this last 16 years. Many people were very skeptical that the boat, as President Xi Jinping likes to say, would navigate even in the storm and be here where we are, having the 14th summit. And I think we are strong. And now is going to arrive in the second stage of the BRICS. That's going to be BRICS Plus, enlarging the group with new countries. So I think it's a very successful trajectory.
Right. And Mr. Andrei, from Russia's perspective, what reforms are needed to the current global governance system?
It needs a lot of reforms, especially how to develop the BRICS countries, the alliance of the BRIC countries, because now just the voice of the BRICS countries is not so loud than voices from the USA and any other country. And how to do it? Now there are some progress, there are some questions how to do it, but in my opinion, it's necessary to implement economic development of the BRICS countries. And now China is the leader of the BRICS countries, and a Chinese initiative is in front of all these movements. I mean, in 2013, China proposed its Chinese initiative, One Belt, One Road. And judging by after realization of this initiative, I consider a lot of emerging countries, and they began to develop its infrastructure, and they have a lot of economic possibilities how to develop. For example, only one example about Laos, because once I took part in one conference in Guangzhou, and the representative of Laos, he said earlier, nobody knows what is the country Laos. It's a very small country, no seaports and any other problems. But after building this railway from Kunming to Vientiane, they have a number of possibilities to develop economy. And now, in my opinion, if we have the BRICS countries will has a lot of just any projects, now all the BRICS countries will have much more voices in the world international arena. That's my point, my opinion on this issue.
Thank you. And Mr. Damuri, you mentioned G7 and taking place next week. We know there are different views among BRICS and G7. For example, the G7 countries are imposing sanctions on Russia, and the majority of the developing countries opted not. In your opinion, how to resolve these differences, and what can be done to establish a more just and equitable global governance environment?
Yeah, it's quite interesting questions. Just and what you mean, what you said before. A just and more equitable global governance, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, it's quite interesting because I think we have to admit that global governance is still dominated by developed countries at the moment, as Alessandro also mentioned before. But it's quite understandable, given its resources, technology, and they are also equipped with a suitable and enough mechanism to carry out and to push, to promote their agenda. But we cannot cannot live with that kind of situations for the forever, of course. So I think it's about time that the developed countries need to take more attention of the needs of the other countries, include especially developing and less developed countries, and BRICS can also voice their aspiration as well. But from the developing countries as well, they also need to be more active to voice their aspirations. And by what I mean by voicing their aspiration is not only to say no or to reject any agenda, but also come up with alternative. That's what many developing countries, I think, also including BRICS members, lack principally to come up with alternative. Say, for example, on the climate change issues, what we have, the narrative and the initiative so far come mostly from the Western countries, from the developed countries. What the developing countries says, just either reject or begging for more attention. But we have to come up with a new alternative, with an alternative narrative, for example. And in order to do that, in order to leverage that, we also need to find more common understanding among developing countries itself. BRICS are 5 countries that are quite influential to the global economy, but there are many other countries that are quite influential, like my country, Indonesia, for example, or Turkey, for examples, or Mexico. They are also part of the G20, and we can come up with a new alternative narration. We can come up with new aspirations that can be voiced into the global governance.
Right. And Mr. Wang, we earlier talked about the consensus among BRICS countries, and we can see that this year's summit has reached a lot of consensus, even we should say the growing consensus among BRICS countries. But as the inclusion of more members is now happening in the next stage, help us understand what will it bring to the organization, and will it be challenging to build unity with more members?
Well, I think that the inclusion of new members in BRICS is a very, very good thing. Because we all know the inclusion of new members will make BRICS country more open, more inclusive, and more promising. Unlike G20, because we know the unlike the G7, I mean, because the G7 is a closed, small group, and the BRICS system is open, it's very inclusive. So now we push the BRICS Plus. It's a very good way to better integrate the interest of emerging countries and other developing countries to form a stronger collective voice. Because we all know nowadays the world is no longer dominated by the West, and the developing countries will united and choose a stronger power and a stronger voice and a stronger representatives. Because but of course, you mentioned that the challenges, we admit, of course, it's not easy because there are so many developing countries, 170 plus developing countries. It's not easy for so many countries to unite because the United States often adopt and push the strategy of a so-called offshore balance to provoke the internal strife among the developing countries and push the developing country clash and struggle each other. And another reason is that for some developing country has some domestic political reasons. Because in some developing countries, when they change their, they will change the foreign policy if they change political party to govern. So, but even that, overall, we are very full of hope for the BRICS and the BRICS Plus mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Teixeira, what are your thoughts on BRICS expansion? Will it happen shortly?
Yes. That is already happening. When you see the NDB, that is countries like Egypt, UAE, other countries like Argentina, and other countries in different regions in Africa, in South America, and East Asia wants to be part of the BRICS. The enlargement of BRICS is very important, especially because we are living in a critical moment. I think not a lot of people touch this issue. That is, especially United States, try to building a club. Okay, we saw that. I know that is not the topic here, but we saw that during the Summit of the Americas, where you say, oh, just my friends are invited. Okay, this is not the world we want to build. This is not why BRICS was built. BRICS was built to have voices in developing countries, to treat each other at the same level. And again, we cannot just forget the situation that Russia is going through now in the case of Ukraine. Who is hurting is the small business, medium business, the supply chain that is cut off by embargo of the United States. And they have been doing that for a long time to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Venezuela in Latin America. So I think it's time already for us to have a better dialogue between developing countries and developed countries. You cannot keep pushing us. And that's my point. So we must enlarge BRICS. We must embrace the concept of BRICS Plus, and that needs to be done in all different spheres of the BRICS mechanism.
Right, and what do you think about the challenges to unite so many countries? We know over 140 developing countries agree not to impose sanctions on Russia, but there are also other issues like their governance model and their ideologies, because we're seeing increasingly that the United States is going unilateral, but do you think multilateral among developing countries is the way forward? Mr. Teixeira?
It's very important because the issues that we have that put a common ground. What we have, unemployment, we have, like in China, we have unemployment in China, we have unemployment in India, Russia, in all the Malaysia, Indonesia. We have many problems. We have poverty, we have inequality. Those are issues that are typical from developed countries and have been hurting our countries for a long time. When you're talking about sustainable development, oh, it's fine for the developed countries to destroy their forests, to destroy their biodiversity, and give the bill for developing countries saying, now you don't have the right to do development because you need to preserve your biodiversity. This is wrong, and we need to stand for it. So there is challenges, but we need to work together on this.
Indeed, and it's very interesting to see some developed countries are resorting to coal in the face of rising gas and oil prices. And Mr. Andrei, what's your expectation of BRICS expansion? What new momentum will BRICS Plus bring?
I do agree with the previous speakers. We must enlarge the BRIC countries organization. Now there are only 5 countries here, but it's necessary to have much more countries. I mean, not. But which criteria should we choose? In my opinion, that the GDP, the population, and territory, square of the territory, and any other energy resources, and maybe there are a few countries that just now could join the BRICS countries organization. The BRICS, I mean, first of all, Turkey, and then Indonesia, Iran. Now they are going to join the BRICS. But that's one more problem, how to organize this process. It's quite a problem, maybe in a few years, maybe in a year. But now just there is one representative from Indonesia. Now, in my opinion, Indonesia is eager to join the BRICS because the BRICS has its loud voice in the international arena. And now just when emerging countries is just competing with any other developed countries like the USA and European countries, now it's necessary to develop, to enlarge the BRICS organization, and it's necessary to do so. It's very difficult to do it in a few years, but in my opinion, the best way to enlarge the BRICS organization as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Damuri, Indonesia is a strong representation of the emerging economy. Do you see a future of Indonesia in BRICS Plus, and what do you expect from it?
Yeah, I think it's quite possible that Indonesia would join the group, but more importantly, I think for other developing countries to also have exchange with BRIC member at the moment. So we cannot expect that BRICS will be expanded to more than I don't know, like 30 or 40 developing countries in the world, right? But the thing is how BRICS can have mechanisms to also accommodate aspirations from other developing countries. I think BRICS need to also come up with this kind of mechanisms. Like, for example, just a simple thing, to invite other leaders to BRICS summit, for example. I'm not sure it has been done in the past. Maybe it has been done in the past, but for sure, I don't think it is done for the current summit. Like for G7 countries, they always invite others, including also developing countries, to their summit. And this kind of mechanism, this is a simple mechanism, but BRIC member can also come up with more sophisticated or more accommodative mechanisms in order to get the aspirations. In another note, BRICS also need to increase its presence by offering something concrete, concrete benefits to other countries, to other developing countries, like the agenda or resource pooling or resource employment that can be done, that can be used by other other developing countries as well, in addition to the member countries.
Mm-hmm. And talking about specific mechanisms, Mr. Wang, we know the summit is also expected to boost the multilateral trading system. How will BRICS further explore multilateral trade, and will member countries expand local currency settlement? Is America's weaponization of the dollar a concern?
Well, you mentioned the multilateralism. So we all know that multilateralism is the collective consensus of the BRICS country. And the BRICS countries' multilateralism respects the Charter of the United Nations and presume equality, openness, and mutual respect. I think this is true multilateralism. And it's very, very different from the United States multilateralism. The so-called US multilateralism, they want to establish the multilateralism led by the United States, which is unfair and selfish. And so the purpose of BRICS country explorations of multilateral trade is to ensure the smooth flow of industrial chain and supply chain and build an open world economy. So among them, it's a very, very important process to promote the local currency settlement, as you mentioned, and the BRIC, the hegemony of the United States. So at present, I think the United States regards energy, trade, and the dollar as weapons against the other countries, as you mentioned. So I think this is very, very dangerous. This is damage to modern human civilization. It will promote the de-dollarization process of the other countries. And the final result will be the end of the US dollar hegemony. I trust it.
Right. And Mr. Teixeira, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the United States is weaponizing its dominance in global economy and global financial system? What can be done by BRICS?
Always use dollar as a weapon and have been doing that for, again, the example I give to Cuba, do you know, it's always been there, okay? Mm-hmm. So yeah, of course, BRICS has, as I said, more than 30% of the global GDP. It's time for us to sit together and increase our trade between ourselves in local currency. We can do that. I think digital, one of the points that have been discussing a lot is that digital currency from the central banks would be a way out. That's why China put a lot of efforts and was one of the first countries to have the digital currency RMB put in place. So that's very important. But also it's important not only to trade in the case with local currency, but also to boost what we call the trade facilitation agreement. Is a WTO framework. It's very important. I think in the BRICS countries in the future, the BRICS Plus can achieve important elements on that. And we can cooperate and boost trade to working together to market access, to financial instruments. We have the New Development Bank as a very important element that can have in one of the pillars of the New Development Bank trade, local trade, helping infrastructure of the countries. So I do believe that one way to fight against the weaponization of the dollar is to increase trade between the partners. And again, that's a discussion that G20 is going to have in the future. Because when you see the tax debate that the OECD had, the minimum tax that G7 had done in the last meeting, we need to take this discussion to G20 and make developing countries have their own position on these issues.
Indeed. And Mr. Andrei, we know that the U.S.-led sanctions on Russia is causing an energy crisis around the world. Well, Russia is diversifying its export destination of its energy products. What is your expectation of Russia's trade outlook and future arrangements of trade with developing countries?
Thank you very much for your question. It's very interesting for us, for Russia. Now, as far as you know, just the Western countries imposed just a lot of sanctions on Russia. I mean, but speaking about Russia is one of the several countries in the world that we have a lot of energy resources like oil, crude oil, natural gas, that's the coal, and now that it's very interesting. Think how to use, how to sell our production. And in my opinion, the best way to sell our production to use rubles, because now just since the end of the last century, our businessmen, they prefer to have more dollars. But now just ruble, because there was a lot of problems with our Russian currency, ruble. But now, just as far as you see, judging when our president Vladimir Putin declared that we should sell our energy resources for rubles, not for dollars, not for euro, as currency rate, ruble is increasing. And it's very interesting. And speaking about the BRICS countries, earlier I would like to dwell on the history, because earlier there was one organization between Russia and former socialist countries, the experience of the Council of Mutual Economic Aid. And we have our own currency when we trade, because earlier all these former socialist countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, they had no problems with energy resources because they received energy resources from the Soviet Union, from former Soviet Union. And now just that time there was no problems with them. But now they have a lot of problems because now they should pay in euro, in American dollars, and they have a lot of energy resources there in their countries, in their own countries. And now, in my opinion, when we are going to develop cooperation within the BRICS countries, it's necessary to develop our new development bank and to create a new currency like former like a currency during the period of the former Soviet Union, the period of the Council of Mutual Economic Aid. In my opinion, it's very necessary to develop our just mutual cooperation within the BRICS countries. And now we have only 5 members of the BRICS. But in my opinion, it must more. We have more countries, not 5, but 7, 6, 7, 8. But and you know, the main thing in the health, we should develop our trade only using our financial system, our to use a new currency within our just the BRICS countries.
Right, and Mr. Damuri, BRICS hope to deepen cooperation with other emerging markets and developing countries. As Mr. Teixeira just mentioned, he hoped more talks about multilateral trade arrangements at the upcoming G20. What is your expectation of it?
Yeah, trade cooperation basically will take place if there are several preconditions that have been fulfilled. The first, of course, it's the political stability at the international or regional level. The experience of East Asia and Southeast Asia, for example, told us a lot that trade cooperations and also economic cooperations can flourish in the place that has political stability, like in the regions. So that's one thing. Another thing is also for sure about economic purpose and economic advantage between those countries. In that, that BRICS actually can promote those 2 issues. First is to come up with mechanisms or with an institutions that can create or can promote stability, political stability. And then the second also to come up with platforms that manage that can provide more informations about developing countries, comparative advantage about developing countries, what you call this, performance, so that they can cooperate each other, and they know how to utilize, to employ the difference between them in order to come up with a greater trade and economic cooperations.
And Mr. Wang, China is also seeking high-quality partnerships and high-quality cooperation with a focus on new growth engines. How will BRICS expand cooperation in areas such as digital economy, sustainable development to foster a new momentum?
Well, I think it's a very, very important topic. So in the recent years, the BRICS countries have taken digital economy and sustainable development as a priority development direction. And the BRICS country established the digital BRICS working group and reached the framework of BRICS digital economy partnership. And it's very clearly that in recent years, the e-commerce, e-government, and the digital currency of the BRICS country have achieved the rapid development. For example, the growth of the e-commerce market of the BRICS country is far more 20% or even higher. So this has also support by the rapid economic development of a BRICS country. So in addition, a BRICS country attach a great importance to digital security, oppose data protectionism, and established a digital trained ecological government system and data pricing system, etc. So I think nowadays the digital economy becomes much more important than before, and the BRICS countries can do more. And I think the general idea of a BRICS country is digital BRICS and a sharing economy.
And Mr. Teixeira, what are your thoughts on this? What new growth points can be explored for BRICS countries?
I think there is many important points in cooperation that I think, especially at this moment with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, COVID-19, recovery of the economy, not achieving the sustainable development targets that we establish, that I think the BRICS countries can cooperate. We can talk about, as we mentioned, trade cooperation. We can talk about policy coordination, for example, monetary policy coordination, financial coordination to get out of this weaponization of the dollar that expose not only, again, not only Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but all developing countries. When you're talking about inflation pressure, when the Central Bank of the United States and European Union raise the interest rates, who is going to reflect? It's going to reflect in developing countries. Okay, we know this story. This is an old story. So we need to have more cooperation in policy coordination. We need to have cooperation, as Professor Wang mentioned in the beginning, about science, technology, innovation. We are already grow-up countries. We don't need only Europe. We don't need only United States. We don't need to them to talk about democracy or to come to us to teach what we should do or you should not do it. So again, I think we have frameworks at the BRICS, at the G20, at the G24 that we need to put our voice stronger. We cannot allow the United States and some part of the Western media demonize Russia without knowing the history. We need to explain what's going on. We need to be bold enough to say, okay, look what's going on in the world. There is not a good, and this part is good and the others are evil, because that's not the world we want. Okay, so it's very important. And the only way we can do that is if we cooperate between ourselves. I see, and I come from a continent, Latin America, that have been oppressed by hunger, by poverty, by crime. And everything that we look at is saying, okay, there is no, if it was not China, if it was not India or Russia helping during COVID-19, there is not one single dose of vaccine that enter and add from United States or from European Union to my region. So there is no single vaccine that went to Africa from this region. So it's very nice to talk about development when you don't have any help from the developed world. And that's, I think, is the big and most important challenge for the developing countries, to get together and to cooperate.
And the developed countries also fell short about their climate change funding for developing countries. But talking about these negative spillovers on developing countries due to the monetary policy of the developed world, Mr. Teixeira, do you think BRICS can create a new financial order to help developing countries, like the New Development Bank? What can we expect?
That was the idea when we set. That's why the New Development Bank is not called BRICS Bank. It's called New Development Bank, because when we set that, and in fact, one of the most important meetings was during the Boao Forum some years ago, when the BRICS had a meeting, was the idea not to replace the World Bank, but we know from developing countries that the agenda of the World Bank is a developed countries bank, is a recipe that they come to developed countries and say, or you do that or I don't give you money. We are tired of this, okay? Each country, as China shows and India shows, needs to fight and its own development path. And we cannot impose an agenda. So of course, in my opinion, the new development bank has this role, and that's why we need to enlarge the new development bank, not to impose an agenda, but to help them to build their own agenda, every single country. For example, I know a little bit about Indonesia. They have 17,000 islands. They need infrastructure, but they cannot get infrastructure with an agenda predetermined by the World Bank. So it's time for us to stand up and work together.
And there much more needs to be done. And Mr. Andrei, how will Russia seek new growth momentum amid Western sanctions?
My opinion, I just answered this question, how to just struggle against Western sanctions, because as far as I know, now West is very difficult to just to do something with sanctions, because now they have a lot of problems with their own sanctions. I mean, first of all, from energy resources. But I agree with Mr. Teixeira that it's necessary to develop our new development bank in order to just create a new currency, just instead of dollars, maybe together with American dollars. Because, for example, like Russia, like the Soviet Union, just in the 60s and in the 80s, and it's necessary to develop some emerging countries, because, for example, Indonesia and then India, because it's necessary to invest more money into some new just development projects. And it's necessary to have a lot of investments to do so. And now, in my opinion, we must dwell on Chinese experience. I mean, One Belt, One Road, and the Silk Road of the 21st century. It's very interesting for all developing countries to this experience. And speaking about Russia, unfortunately, has no such experience like Chinese initiative, One Belt, One Road. And it's necessary to just to unite these emerging countries, I mean BRICS countries, in order to develop our cooperations in different spheres, not only in financial, but in industrial. And in my opinion, the most important thing to develop cooperation in science and technique, to develop science, to create joint education programs, scientific programs, in order to create a new products. I mean, digital economy and nanotechnology, and in order to be in front of any other countries, because now our universities, our Academy of Sciences could do something in this sphere. And that's my opinion, how to develop a mutual cooperation between BRICS countries.
And Mr. Damuri, what opportunities do you see in these new growth areas, and how can deepen cooperation between developing countries?
Yeah, first, I agree with all the previous speakers. That we have a lot of areas of cooperations actually with among developing countries that can lift up the situation, the economic situations, and BRICS actually can provide platforms, can also offer concrete proposals and agenda. But again, the thing is how we can come up with that kind of agenda, concrete agendas, as I also highlight before. Sometimes or most of times, the developing countries, they just reject agenda or initiative without offering alternative. but BRICS can also take this opportunity at a higher level. Like for example, the new development bank, it can provide that kind of platforms for exchange with other developing countries as well, and improve or enhance cooperations, provide more informations about developing countries, about the opportunities of cooperations among developing countries. So, but I haven't seen the real case of this, at least it hasn't really been circulated enough sufficiently among other developing countries. So there would be some kind of agenda or initiative that BRICS with other developing countries can promote, because we do have a lot of challenges in the future. Like for example, climate change. It is real, and we have to deal with it. But sometimes the agenda might not be in line with the agendas of developed countries. In developing countries, we need to pay more attention on how to adapt to the climate change, to the extreme weather, for example.
Right.
And it is not really under the aspirations of most developed countries. BRICS can provide that kind of a platform of cooperation between developing countries.
And there are a lot to expect from this mechanism to build more unity among the developing world. Well, that's all the time for today. I think the summit has sent a strong BRICS voice with an emphasis on equity, inclusiveness, sustainability, openness, and win-win cooperation, and it will be heard by the world. And thanks again to all of our guests today: Wang Wen, Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China; Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira, former Chief Economic Advisor to the President of Brazil; and Ostrovkii Andrei, Head of the Center for Social and Economic Development of China at the Institute of Far Eastern Studies and Russian Academy of Sciences; and Yose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia. Thanks again to our viewers for being with us. And that's all for our special program of BRICS Summit. I'm Guan in Beijing. Bye-bye.